What's up guys, SkyKevin here, and today I wanted to talk about the DMCA takedown that's been going on between Dark and Darker and Nexon Studios, or rather Iron Mace Games and Nexon Studios. I want to go over everything that's happened as well as a few key details that I have personally noticed when looking into this myself. So, let's get started. So if you haven't heard by now, Iron Mace is the developer for Dark and Darker, which is a hugely successful Steam game, and now Nexon is coming for them because they had a project called P3. Nexon decided to cancel P3, and the developers from that left and made Dark and Darker. As a result, Nexon is now mad, and they submitted a DMCA takedown notice to Steam and Valve. Now that you're all caught up, I'm not going to get into too many of the details because I think there's too many other videos out there that have gone into a lot of the specifics of what's located on the Discord here and things like that. So instead, I want to go into some of the other things that you might not have necessarily heard of yet. Starting with this Gamepull article that was posted on March 10th of 2023. And in this article, it's actually Nexon already prefacing everything before they've actually taken the steps of the DMCA takedown notice. Now, this is translated from a Korean website, so a lot of the wording here is going to be different, and I don't know if this is the actual literal translation of what they're actually talking about. Basically, they state in this article that a developer was working for them, left them, and decided to make Dark and Darker. What I want to specifically highlight here is that Iron Mace responded through a statement on the 9th saying Dark and Darker was developed by ourselves from the beginning, and we have never used any inappropriate trade secrets, and we can prove it through all of our records. However, they state that resources such as codes are still in the fog because they can be changed to other forms as much as possible during the migration process. It's kind of interesting, isn't it, that they've already stated here that the code they used might not actually be the code that's in Dark and Darker, but they're already trying to preface it with that within this article, knowing that a lot of it might not match up. They state as well that they have multiple testimonies that Nexon was planning to introduce the P3 project as the first title of Mint Rocket, and in July 2020, the new development started on the game, and all the major concepts were completed within Nexon. A year later, the lead developer was fired for taking out thousands of files containing most of the development information without permission. One of the craziest things is this statement here. As the core developers were eliminated, the P3 team was forced to disband, and Nexon filed a criminal complaint for violating the act on prevention of unfair competition and protection of trade secrets. I want you to really pay attention to this part though, that the P3 team was forced to disband because they had lost the core developers. This is going to be highly relevant because the core developer is mentioned throughout the DMCA, and to me shows that there's a lot of shady stuff going on with Nexon's claims here. They then move on to talk about a few of the other games that they have and defend themselves in being pay to win. But then they come to this other point, which they say success in legal defense doesn't mean you're right. And they actually admit that there's a possibility that it was implemented directly by themselves or directly in the head by reviving the memory during the development of P3. Whether resources such as codes were created from scratch or migrated, there is no problem with the law as long as they are different from the previous form. What they're basically saying here is that there's a good chance that the team didn't use source code and that they just made everything from scratch. And although that is completely acceptable within the law, they still think that Iron Mace is in the wrong. They then go on to say that Dark and Darker will inevitably serve as a fatal precedent in the gaming world, and go on to say that a lot of the developers at Nexon were deprived of their labor and passion, and that they've lost all this money on making the game. This was all very important information to take into account now, because Nexon is going to have a few other decisions that contradict a lot of what they've said here. So let's go into the DMCA takedown itself. We're going to go through piece by piece, and I've got a few notes on exactly what was going on here. So the first thing I want to point out is that this DMCA was sent directly to Steam and Valve. So this is not something that Iron Mace really had a say in, do they want to do this or not. They were essentially, Steam was the one that took their stuff down on behalf of Nexon making this claim. The reason why Steam had to give in to this is when a DMCA strike happens, in order for Steam to no longer be liable, they need to take the video down, or they could face legal consequences if it does turn out that there were assets being used under copyright. They begin with stating that the game itself appears to have used trade secrets as well as copyrighted information copied and stolen from Nexon. And they state the trade secrets such as source codes, art resources, and build files, as well as other company intellectual property. Further, they say that there is literary work, which is source code, work of visual arts, aka character designs, and motion picture / AV work, their playtest video, that has been copywritten. And then they state the facts, that Nexon began developing a new first-person shooter role-playing game known as the P3 game under the P3 project in August of 2020 for 11 months until July 2021. There were 20 Nexon employees, and they invested around $800,000 US to develop the P3 game. They then state all of the different copyrights that they took out here. And the first three are pretty straightforward. You've got the actual program itself, you've got all the rest of the game assets and any other audiovisual content, and then you actually have the playtest demo as well that they ended up copywriting. Numbers 4 till 9 are all the 2D concept artwork of each of the characters. One of the first things that you'll notice here is this point where they say, "We have learned that at least one Nexon employee, specifically Joo-Hyun Choi, who is the team leader of the P3 project, had access to all the P3 files, and he acquired and transferred them without authorization to his personal server in 2020 and 2021. This is going to be important a little later on, too, when it comes to timelines. They state that upon discovery of his misconduct, Nexon disciplined and terminated him in July of 2021. At that point, he approached P3 project members, urging them to leave Nexon and create a game similar to P3 outside of Nexon. And additionally, Terrence Park, who is now the lead CEO of Iron Mace Games. But they do specify that Terrence Park left Nexon on August 9th, 2021, which means Terrence Park left Nexon after the game was canceled in July. Now, I don't know about a lot of you, but usually if a developer is working on a game and it suddenly gets canceled, they're going to start looking for another job. And in this case, if the game was canceled in July and then he decides to leave in August, why wouldn't Terrence Park leave before then, before the game is ever canceled? In fact, like I told you before, they explicitly stated that due to losing their core development team, they had to cancel the project in July. But Terrence Park was still there before they canceled the project. So they never needed to cancel the project because Terrence Park was there. So unless Joo-Hyun Choi was the integral piece of making this game in the first place, Nexon is blaming him for stealing the files to go make his own game and also essentially saying he was the only one that they could have to make a game like this in the first place. You can talk about whether or not he stole trade secrets, and maybe that will happen, but we're going to go over that a little later on once we get to the actual evidence and we start scrutinizing that. But I did want to point out this piece down here where they talk about the game itself and the fact that no other game could possibly make this same genre, concept, and plot as the P3 game. It's kind of ridiculous when you think about it because the game's main core mechanics are so incredibly similar to games like Escape from Tarkov that it just doesn't make sense that they would even try to make claims like this. And then they find, after investigating all of the source files of Dark and Darker and the P3 game, that 2,338 of them were identical, which once again, we'll go over that in a little bit. Some of the other ridiculousness that they include is that this game has very similar features, like brick walls and torch mechanics being the case, which I think if anyone would have told them about a game called Minecraft and the fact that you need torches to get light in that game, it's pretty much the same reaction. If you made Minecraft in Unreal Engine 5, I'm pretty sure it would look very similar whenever you place a torch on the ground. And then they state that the game assets, although being from the same Unreal Engine marketplace, being together make the games look too similar. And we'll go over that all in Exhibit E as well. Finally, they explain that the game descriptions are the same, and that somehow because they've described Dark and Darker, and because they've described this game, and they come out as the same description, that somehow it's basically the same game as well. And as a result, they have advised Valve that if they do not take down all versions of Dark and Darker on Steam, then they may be liable for direct and indirect copyright infringement, as the DMCA requires of Valve. If we go down a bit, we can see here that Nexon owns registered copyrights of the following things that I've already explained down below. And now we get into Exhibit B. Now Exhibit B is looking at all the different copyrights or the certificate of registration with these copyrights with the United States Copyright Government Office. There are a few key things to look at in here. The first being that all of these were registered as of February 9th in 2023. So these were all registered far after the Dark and Darker playtests had taken place. And in it, on the year of completion for these copyrights, most of them are 2021, with a few of them being 2020, which I'll point out. And you can see that for each of them, you have the Project P3 code itself that was registered as a copyright. You have the audio-visual material from Project P3 once again. You have the audio-visual material and spoken commentary for the P3 playtest. And then we get into the different Project P3 character art for each of the classes. In this case, we've got the Cleric in 2021, Ranger in 2021, Barbarian 2021, the Tanker or the Fighter class in 2020, the Thief or Rogue class in 2021, and finally the Wizard class in 2020. And note that these are all 2D created artwork that is specifically being copywritten. And now let's get into the timeline stuff like I was telling you about before. So they specifically state in here the misconduct of Joo-Hyun Choi and all the instances, which there are 20 of them, in which he transferred files from Nexon to another server that he was working on. A few interesting things that I want to point out here are, first of all, that as far as having any files on a private server, that only happened from April 7th to May 11th of 2021. So he actually never transferred any personal files after May to his home computer, and everything else on a private server located in Seosan on June 18th and June 23rd, which overall we already know that this was all during the time of COVID, and that's a pretty great example of why. But I think one of the other very important things to remember is that he was the lead developer on this project. I find it very incredibly difficult to have a lead developer working on a project and not giving him access to all of the project files anytime that is necessary for him to work on it. And then we move on to Exhibit D. This is a comparison of the resource file names between the P3 game and Dark and Darker. They state the first thing that there are 2,338 files with the same names, and they admit that if they exclude the number of files essentially included in the Unreal Engine itself, that cuts the number of files that are similar down by about half. And then they list out all of the file names here. Of course, looking at this list of file names, you might think, wow, yeah, there's a lot that are very similar, until you take a closer look at things like brick.uexp as being a file name that's the same, or candle.uexp, or carpet, or curtains, or door1. Now the uexp is a very standard suffix for any sort of file names in Unreal Engine. So you're telling me that if an asset is labeled as brick, that will show up as a similarity between these two games. And I know that a lot of other people have pointed this out as well. There's a very high likelihood that if you're making a game about dungeons, you're both going to have a brick asset in there somewhere. But looking at this stuff even further, you can see from the actual comparison of resources that Iron Mace so lovingly decided to keep on tap and show everyone clearly states where each of the other additional names come from. So things like a Blockout Tools plugin, an Ancient Treasures one, or the Fantasy Dungeon pack for all of the environments that they used. In fact, out of all the different assets that were similar in name from one game to the other, there was only 82 assets that were made by Iron Mace. And out of these 82 assets, all of them were duplicates, meaning there was really only 41 instances where this was the case. And once again, we see things like Fireball or Backstab being part of the names that are considered duplicates. Further, you can see that there are some names like GA Rest or GA Walk, but these are really common naming conventions whenever you're developing a game. Using things like underscores to separate the different categories, it just makes sense. What I find so incredibly ridiculous about this is that if I were to go out right now and make a game on Unreal Engine 5 using the Modular Skeleton Army pack, I would probably have just as many different similarities here between the P3 game, my game, and Dark and Darker. So overall, I think this is just a very ridiculous stance for Nexon to take. I would argue that if anyone can not end up using a lot of these names to make a fantasy game, then it would be very, very difficult to do so. Finally, we move on to Exhibit E. Going into the similarities between the P3 game and Dark and Darker, we can look at the character design here. And of course, with these character designs, they all have very similar classes and art style between them. And one thing that I want to make very clear about this is that everything that you just looked at is actually pictures instead of Dark and Darker, instead as D&D characters. That's right. So everything that you were looking at, if you just glossed over it, you'll see that the P3 game has very similar art assets to Dark and Darker, which has very similar art assets to games like Dungeons & Dragons. Gee, I wonder why. Maybe because both of those games was based off of Dungeons & Dragons, and you can even see it in the art style used here. But further than that, looking at the different artwork that's used here, there's a lot of stuff that I think, and one of the main things about looking at it from an artistic perspective is that if you look at it at face value, they definitely look very similar. But if you're looking at this as an artist, you'll probably notice that they're completely and utterly different. If I take one image and cut it out and copy and paste it on top of the other image, that is copying someone else's artwork. If I take the image on the left and hand draw a brand new image on the right, inspired by the image on the left, that is not copyright. And in fact, you'll notice that as you go through any of these images, although they do look very similar in terms of whether or not they have capes or whether they have helmets or shields or things like that, at face value, yes, they do look similar. But what they don't look like is the exact same picture. And I think that's the problem with what Nexon is doing here. They're basically stating that, for instance, the wizard is the exact same as the Dark and Darker wizard. Yet, when you look at them, the images are completely different. They have the same subject matter within them. You've got a wizard with a staff that's got a robe. And in fact, you could probably make the comparison that his spellbook is there. He's got multiple layers on. He's got one of them has a pointy hat. But the reality is that we know for a fact, looking at one image from the other, that both images were drawn individually. And of course, they've already stated in the article that this is drawn by the same artist, so he's going to have the very similar art style. But I think what's really taking away from this point is the fact that this artist clearly worked on two individual drawings. And at least to me, I would never go to an artist and say, hey, by the way, I want you to draw me an image, but it can't have any resemblance to any image you have ever drawn before. And I think largely the point of copyright is to stop people from copy and pasting the other image and just putting that down. And instead, we know for a fact that because he put in the time, the effort, and the work, that what Nexon is doing by saying that these are the same image is discounting and discrediting all of the work that this artist made of the Dark and Darker concept art. And finally, we get to the meat of it, that the P3 game is intended to demonstrate a fearful and dark atmosphere by using dungeons with dark brick walls as the background and setting of the game, and introducing torch-related in-game features. Now, not only are they describing pretty much every other game out there, but we're going to get into the actual side-by-side comparison. Now, I know what you're thinking. Once again, at face value, wow, these games look so similar, don't they? Well, not exactly. If you're looking at this as some person who's never played a video game before in your life, you might take a look at these two games and say, yes, look at how similar they are. They've got a dark dungeon, they've got brick walls, they even have the same assets being used in these two examples. But I can argue that that is completely false, because I can personally point out quite a few differences between these two photos that a lot of people aren't taking into account. For instance, take a look at things like the torches themselves. These torches look completely different. They're both torches, absolutely, but the flame effects are different colors and different hues. They're clearly not taken from the same source code, unless they decided to edit the flames on the animation itself. You can see the health bar UI is completely different. The color is different. The font is different. The icons are in different spots. The minimap is different. The HUD and UI is different. The way that you use items is different. The compass at the top is completely different. It's a compass, absolutely, but it's all different. And so when you're looking at this, yes, it looks like a very similar game, but it looks like a similar game because it's using the same assets and everything else. But as you can clearly see, there were so many different mechanics that were completely redone between the two games. And I think this is where I want to get to the meat of the problem with what Nexon is doing. Nexon is stating that this is an exact copy and that they have stolen this game from Nexon, when in reality, it's very clear to any and all of us that the P3 game inspired Dark and Darker being made. And I absolutely agree that it is pretty sus that developers that used to work at Nexon went over and started making Dark and Darker. It is completely believable that they used a lot of what they had worked on in the P3 game, at least in terms of knowledge and experience, in order to recreate that when they went to go and work for Dark and Darker. But the idea that Nexon can claim ownership of that really is just ridiculous. They can't force their developers to forget how they made the game that they wanted them to make. No developer is going to just randomly forget about these things. And like I said, when you're looking at the comparisons between these two photos, look very specifically at all the little minor details. The fact that there's a spell book on the back of that character. Is that character model the exact same as the character model that you're seeing in this photo here? Does the front image on the fighter token there with the health bar and everything else within his party match the one on the left? They're all completely different. So why on earth would you steal the source code from this one game, move it over to your game, and then just completely change around all of the source code and assets for it in the first place when you could probably just as easily make it from scratch because you've done it before? You know how to do it quite clearly. And lastly, they talk about the key concepts, the genre, the storyline, the detailed elements of the game. And they really try to use, once again, a very weak argument, which is that the game description of Dark and Darker is very similar to the P3 game. And I just want to point out a few things that I noticed here. For instance, they use "after hearing rumors of great fortune" as being the same as "unfathomable fortunes await," which to me, they definitely sound similar, but are they so similar that that would constitute copying another game? I think that's pretty loosely based, especially when they say that in the green text here, you can keep everything you have plundered if you escape the dungeon safely and avoid countless dangers. And meanwhile, on the Dark and Darker's description, once you've plundered your riches, now comes the hard part, getting out alive. Well, wait a minute. The Dark and Darker one doesn't ever state that you can keep everything you've plundered. So realistically, Dark and Darker isn't including these things. And I think that's one of the main problems with a lot of what Nexon is claiming. There are a lot of differences between Dark and Darker and the P3 game if you're looking for differences. If you're looking for similarities, you're absolutely going to find them. But looking at all of the differences, you're going to see that they are actually quite different, other than the overall concept being the same. But if you're looking at it as an overall concept being the same, well, I think Escape from Tarkov or any game like that is going to have a pretty big issue with what you're doing here. And then finally, they talk that all the summarized characteristics of the P3 game are evident in Dark and Darker. Being a PvPvE game, having FPS and RPG elements, having a 16-user starting point, which isn't actually even true anymore. The last beta, they expanded it from 16 to 20 users participating in one game, including character classes like the Fighter, Barbarian, Cleric, and Thief, and having the background be in a setting of dark bricks in a dungeon with torch features. I'm not positive about this, but somebody could probably make a custom mod based off of this in Minecraft in like a day or two. And then, of course, we have the overall response on the Discord channel from Dark and Darker. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you've probably already seen something like that already, and you're already following Dark and Darker. I think the main thing to take into account here is that Nexon has essentially shot themselves in the foot by trying way too hard to look at the specifics of what they're talking about. The main things that I would say here is that, yes, Dark and Darker is inspired by P3. There's no doubt about that, and there's no doubt that the developers of Dark and Darker used some of their knowledge from developing P3 in order to make this game. But to make then the legal claim that Dark and Darker has been stolen from Nexon is completely and utterly ridiculous. And that is absolutely evident in the fact that if Nexon really wanted to beat Dark and Darker in a fair way, they would just develop P3 and release that as well. Clearly, Dark and Darker doesn't have the copyrights on these things, and they are not trying to push against Nexon. So why is Nexon, with a studio much, much larger than Iron Mace, not developing P3 or continuing the development of P3 and finally releasing it? And I think it's pretty obvious to everybody that it's because they decided to scrap the development in July of 2021. And it's very clear that they decided to scrap the development because Terrence Park was still working for Nexon even after they decided to scrap the project. So they decided they're not going to pursue the project anymore. Terrence Park was still working there, and it was only until after Terrence Park left and decided he wanted to make Dark and Darker. So it's very clear that Nexon not only had a head start to get this game to publish and release themselves, but they fired the head developer and then decided to disband the game. And I think that's one of the key things. They never were going to make this game in the first place, and it's only now that the game has started to release and is showing very promising numbers and showing that it's going to make a lot of money, are they upset with the results. And they decided to file some copyrights in order to attack the Dark and Darker team and try to put them out of business, which I personally don't agree with. Now, I am not any sort of internet lawyer, but I can tell you that from looking at all this evidence, the biggest thing we need to pay attention to are the timelines of what is associated with here. From a moral perspective, it is kind of gray area. The Dark and Darker team definitely had inspiration from the P3 team, but we also know that Nexon was never going to make this game in the first place. They filed this as a DMCA takedown just to attack the competition, but they're running a race that they don't even want to finish because we have not seen any sort of P3 gameplay footage. We have not seen any sort of P3 content whatsoever, and they're not even willing to bring out their own source code to compare it to Dark and Darker, which is quite surprising considering Dark and Darker is a game that's almost coming to market, and P3 is, as far as I'm aware, still completely under wraps in Nexon's vault. Now, I will admit my bias on this because obviously I really like the game and I can't wait for it to come out. I've made content on it before, but if we're looking at this, I think those are the facts that we are getting directly from Nexon that really shows us that, well, they're the ones that are in the wrong. I specifically showed everything from the previous article and the DMCA takedown first because I think that it coming from Nexon is pretty much irrefutable evidence that this is what's going on. We can take Iron Mace's word for it that they didn't copy any game files, they didn't copy any source code or anything like that. The idea that a lead developer stole their code out from under them and decided to leave and steal the rest of their team with them is so abundantly false that it has everybody up in arms about what Nexon is trying to do to this smaller development company. But I think really the smoking gun in this whole situation is this point where they say as the core developers were eliminated, the P3 team was forced to disband. The fact that Nexon is blaming this lead developer as being the reason why they couldn't continue the P3 game's development is absolutely ridiculous. Why on earth would you fire your lead developer for looking at the game files that he has been developing, essentially containing them or having them at some point, and then you decide to scrap the project as a whole? I think it's much clearer. They decided to scrap the project and they wanted a reason to fire the lead developer. So they just cited that as their reason and then went about their day. And it wasn't until after they decided to hit him with the lawsuits and deal with everything else that he said, to hell with it, I'm going to make my own game. It's going to be better than the one that I was making for them. And they started working on that in October of that year. I think if Nexon had just decided to take the L and move on, they would have been much better off. They could have stated their concerns about how they disapprove of Dark and Darker and let everyone else support them in that decision. Instead, because they decided to go on this attack and use all of this legal BS, they've really put themselves in a compromising position with a game that now has millions of fans. It'll be interesting to see if there is any blowback from this, because technically DMCA claims need to be warranted in some way. And we'll see what kind of legal response happens from Iron Mace Studios. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.